Australian Economic and Social Outlook Conference in Melbourne. I'm here with Professor Ross Garnaut. Thanks for talking to us, Ross.
Good to be here, Andrew.
Ross, you were talking earlier at a session about policy making in Australia. You talked about the big Australian complacency, you called it. What's going on there?
Well, that's a term I first used at one of these Outlook conferences 13 years ago. That's how long it's been, and I contrasted it with the reform era, where a large number of Australians were engaged in a discussion of things that needed to be done to reform policy to make Australia better. That's all changed. Partly it's a product of prosperity, but we've now had 27 years of continuous growth, but it's also the result of changes in our political culture that make good policy more difficult. We're now seeing policy discussion dominated more by vested interests. We've seen a more partisan divide. We've seen less emphasis on analysis, less respect for knowledge in the public policy discussion. So all of these are elements of the great Australian complacency of the early 21st century.
Are you comparing what today's policy making of the last 13, 15 years with perhaps the 80s when there was the Hawke-Keating? Is that what you're contrasting it with?
Yes, the big contrast is the 17 years from 83 to 2000, which in my book Dog Days, Australia After the Boom, I described as the reform era. I contrast that with the great Australian complacency, which is the 21st century so far. Now, as long as the reform era, just as in the Old Testament, the 7 skinny cows ate the 7 fat cows and didn't get any fatter, the 17 skinny years of complacency have eaten the 17 years of reform. Let's hope there'll be some symmetry and we can get back to serious policy discussion in the public interest.
Do you think we need some sort of, or will take some sort of shock to get us out of this policy complacency, or are you more optimistic that it could change in other ways?
Oh, it doesn't need to take a shock. Obviously, it would be better if we got our act together without that. A recession, that sort of a shock, does a lot of damage to a lot of people. It does a lot of damage to equity. It's best to avoid that. I'd much rather we realise that we've got some serious problems to deal with, problems of climate and energy for one, problems of equity, problems of influence on the policy process by vested interests. Much better that we recognise we've got problems and deal with them without a shock.
Is there one thing you could recommend that we could start doing that we haven't been doing?
I think we need a stronger independent centre of the Australian polity. Now that's the ground occupied by our great universities. It's the ground occupied by the best traditions of our public service. It's the ground occupied by public institutions with independence like the Reserve Bank and the Productivity Commission. It's the ground occupied by independent think tanks. And we've actually got more of those, especially based in Melbourne, actually, than we once had. But that all needs strengthening, and it's challenged by the fact that we don't have such a strong independent media now. The majority media tends to be highly partisan, rather rancorous in its discussion of public policy issues. We need a serious effort to nurture the independent centre of the Australian polity.
And you don't mean a party, you're talking about the think tanks and the other people out there.
I definitely don't mean a party. This is what we need is discussion, analysis, serious consideration of issues that will influence the climate of opinion in which all parties have to operate.
Good on you, Ross. Thanks a million for joining us.